I'll never forget the sound my father made when the sheriff's deputy told him he had 30 minutes to remove his belongings from the house he'd called home for 12 years. It wasn't crying in the way you see in movies, dramatic, loud, cathartic. It was the quiet, broken sound of a man's spirit leaving his body, a whimper that seemed to echo off every window of every house on our street, where neighbors had gathered to watch our family's humiliation unfold in real time. Mrs. Patterson from next door stood on her porch with her arms crossed, shaking her head like our eviction was a moral failing rather than a financial catastrophe. Mr. Williams from across the street pretended to work in his garden while stealing glances at the pile of our possessions growing on the sidewalk. The Johnson kids rode their bikes in slow circles, wide-eyed and whispering, watching what happened when the American dream stopped dreaming back. But it was my father's tears that broke something inside me that could never be repaired. This was the man who had taught me to tie my shoes, to throw a football, to look people in the eye when I spoke to them. The man who had worked 60-hour weeks for 15 years to buy this house, to give his family something permanent in a world that seemed designed to keep people like us permanently temporary. Now he was sitting on our front steps, surrounded by everything we owned, crying in front of people who had once respected him, people who had looked to him as an example of what hard work and determination could accomplish for a black man in America. That day, watching my father's dignity crumble in front of people who had once respected him, I made a vow that would either save our family or destroy me trying. I was 18 years old, 3 months out of high school, with more ambition than experience and more determination than sense. But I was done being a spectator to my family's destruction. I was going to change our story, no matter what it cost me. My name is Terrell Washington, and for the first 17 years of my life, I thought my father was invincible. Marcus Washington was the kind of man other men aspired to be. 6'2", broad-shouldered, with hands that could fix anything, and a voice that commanded attention without ever being raised in anger. He worked as a supervisor at the municipal water treatment plant, a job that paid well enough to support a family of 4 and came with the kind of respect that mattered in our community. In our neighborhood, Dad was the guy people called when they needed advice about home repairs, job applications, or how to handle difficult situations with diplomacy and strength. He coached Little League baseball on weekends, served as a deacon at our church, and never missed a parent-teacher conference or school play. He was proof that a black man could build something lasting through hard work, integrity, and persistence. Our house on Maple Street was modest but well-maintained, with a front yard Dad kept immaculate and a back deck he'd built himself using YouTube tutorials and weekend trips to Home Depot. It wasn't the biggest house on the block, but it was ours, paid for with overtime shifts and careful budgeting, every mortgage payment a small victory against a system that didn't expect families like ours to accumulate wealth. I grew up believing that success was about showing up, working hard, and treating people with respect. Dad embodied those values in everything he did, from the way he dressed for work each morning, always pressed shirt, always polished shoes, to the way he spoke to store clerks and waitresses with the same courtesy he showed his supervisors. "Son," he used to tell me while we worked in the garage on my car, "respect is something you earn through consistency. People are always watching, always deciding whether you're someone they can count on. Make sure the answer is always yes." I was the younger of 2 children, with an older sister, Keisha, who had graduated from college 2 years earlier and was working as a nurse in Atlanta. Keisha had always been the academic star of the family, while I was more interested in entrepreneurship and business. I had started small ventures in high school, buying and reselling sneakers, tutoring younger students, even doing social media marketing for local businesses. My parents supported my entrepreneurial interests, but always emphasized education as the foundation for any success I might achieve. They had both worked their way through community college while raising children, and they expected me to at least match their educational accomplishments. The plan was for me to attend State University in the fall, majoring in business administration with a focus on entrepreneurship. I had been accepted with partial scholarship coverage, and between Dad's steady income and my savings from various business ventures, we had figured out a way to make college affordable without taking on crushing debt. But plans, I learned, are only as stable as the circumstances that create them. And circumstances, especially for working-class families, can change with devastating speed. The crisis began with something as simple as a phone call on a Tuesday evening in March. Dad answered with his usual professional tone, but I watched his expression change from confident to confused to concerned as the conversation progressed. "What do you mean, restructuring?" he asked. "I've been with the department for 15 years. My performance reviews have always been excellent. The municipal water department was facing budget cuts mandated by the city council, and Dad's position, along with 12 others, was being eliminated as part of a efficiency optimization initiative. Despite his seniority and excellent record, he would be laid off in 6 weeks, with a severance package that amounted to 2 months' salary and continued health insurance for 90 days. The news hit our family like a physical blow. Dad had never been unemployed as an adult, had never imagined that his steady government job could simply disappear due to political decisions made by people who had never visited the water treatment plant or met the families who depended on those paychecks. But layoffs, we learned, were just the beginning of our education in how quickly stable families could become struggling families. Have you ever watched the strongest person in your life break completely? When you realize that your childhood was officially over because someone had to become the adult? When you understood that the person you'd always counted on to solve problems had become the problem that needed solving? That's where I found myself at 18, watching my father transform from the most confident man I knew into someone who barely recognized himself in the mirror. The unemployment benefits covered about 60% of Dad's previous income, which meant we could afford either the mortgage or the other bills, but not both. For the first few months, Dad was optimistic about finding new employment. He updated his resume, applied for dozens of positions, went on interviews wearing the same confident expression he'd worn to work for 15 years. But the job market for 50-year-old black men without college degrees was brutal, even for those with excellent work histories and strong references. Age discrimination was illegal, but nearly impossible to prove. Racial bias was subtle but consistently present, and the positions that were available usually paid significantly less than what Dad had been earning. After 3 months of rejections, Dad's confidence began to erode. After 6 months, his optimism turned to quiet desperation. After 9 months, he was taking jobs that paid minimum wage just to contribute something to our household finances. The man who had once supervised a team of 12 people was now stocking shelves at night, his supervisors young enough to be his children, his authority reduced to yes sir and no sir responses to people who didn't understand the depth of experience they were wasting. Watching Dad's pride slowly die was more painful than watching our bank account empty. Every night he came home exhausted, not just from physical labor, but from the psychological weight of being undervalued, overlooked, and dismissed by a system that had once rewarded his contributions. Mom tried to pick up the slack by increasing her hours as a home health aide, but her income alone couldn't cover our family's expenses. The mortgage payments fell behind first, then utilities, then credit card minimums that had once been manageable but became impossible when interest rates increased and minimum payments grew beyond our reach. The stress affected every aspect of our family dynamics. Dad became quiet and withdrawn, spending hours in the garage working on projects that didn't need to be done, avoiding conversations about money or future plans. Mom tried to maintain optimism while secretly researching bankruptcy attorneys and foreclosure prevention programs. I postponed my college enrollment, telling my parents I wanted to take a gap year to help with family finances, but really because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving them to face this crisis alone. My entrepreneurial ventures, which had once been side hustles to save for college, became essential sources of household income. The eviction notice arrived on a Thursday in November, exactly 14 months after Dad had received that phone call about restructuring. We were 4 months behind on mortgage payments, and the bank had exhausted its patience with payment plans and extensions. We had 30 days to come up with $8,400 in back payments and fees, or we would lose our home. That night, sitting around our kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, we faced the mathematical reality of our situation. Even if Dad worked every available hour at his minimum wage job, even if Mom took on additional clients, even if I liquidated every asset from my small business ventures, we couldn't generate enough money to save our house. "Maybe," Dad said quietly, staring at the eviction notice like it was written in a foreign language. "We should start looking for an apartment we can afford." It was the first time I had ever heard my father admit defeat, and it terrified me more than the prospect of homelessness. The eviction process moved with bureaucratic efficiency, each step documented and legal, each deadline precisely calculated to give the appearance of fairness while ensuring a predetermined outcome. Lawyers sent letters on law firm letterhead. Court dates were scheduled during working hours when people like us couldn't afford to miss shifts for legal proceedings. We couldn't afford to defend properly. Dad tried to negotiate with the bank, tried to explain that his unemployment was temporary, that he had a 15-year history of on-time payments, that our family was going through a difficult period but had every intention of honoring our obligations. But banks don't operate on intentions or histories or human circumstances. They operate on risk assessments and profit margins and legal procedures designed to protect their interests while minimizing their exposure to other people's problems. The morning of our eviction arrived gray and cold, with the kind of winter wind that cuts through coats and reminds you that the world doesn't care about your comfort. I woke up early and stood in my empty bedroom, looking out at the street where I had learned to ride a bike, where I had played basketball with neighborhood kids, where I had brought my first girlfriend to meet my parents. Everything that mattered to our family was about to be reduced to whatever we could fit in a rental truck and whatever friends might have space to store temporarily. Dad was in the living room, sitting on the couch we wouldn't be able to keep, staring at family photos he was trying to decide which ones to pack and which ones to leave behind. When the sheriff's deputies knocked on our door at 9 a.m. sharp, he answered with the same dignity he had always carried, even though dignity couldn't stop what was about to happen. "Mr. Washington," the deputy said, not unkindly, "I need to inform you that you have 30 minutes to remove any remaining personal property from these premises." That's when Dad made that sound, that broken whimper that announced the death of everything he had believed about himself, about fairness, about what hard work was supposed to accomplish in America. The neighbors had started gathering before the deputies arrived, drawn by some primitive instinct to witness other people's disasters. Some were genuinely sympathetic, offering help and storage space and kind words. Others were clearly there for the entertainment value, the opportunity to feel superior to people whose circumstances could just as easily become their own. Mrs. Patterson, who had lived next door for 8 years, stood on her porch shaking her head like our eviction was a personal affront to her property values. She had never offered assistance during the months when our financial struggles were becoming obvious, had never asked if there was anything she could do to help a neighbor in crisis, but she was perfectly positioned to judge our failure and to make sure everyone in the neighborhood understood that what was happening to us was somehow deserved, somehow preventable, if we had just made better choices or worked harder or been more responsible. Watching my father's dignity crumble in front of people who had once respected him, people who had looked to him as an example of what hard work and determination could accomplish, I felt something change inside me that would never change back. I wasn't angry at the bank or the deputies or even the neighbors who were treating our disaster like entertainment. I was angry at a system that could take a good man who had played by all the rules, followed every instruction, and done everything right, and still destroy him in front of his community. But more than anger, I felt responsibility. Not the kind of responsibility that comes from guilt or obligation, but the kind that comes from understanding that if I didn't do something, no one would. I watched my hero become human and realized I had to become the hero. That afternoon, sitting in the living room of my aunt's house where we were temporarily staying, surrounded by garbage bags full of clothes and cardboard boxes full of memories, I made a decision that would change everything about our family's trajectory. I was going to build something so successful, so undeniable, so profitable, that we would never again be at the mercy of other people's decisions about our worth or our future. I was going to prove that an 18-year-old with more determination than experience could do what the entire economic system had prevented my father from doing. I was going to change our story, starting that day. The next morning, I woke up at 5 a.m. and started researching every business opportunity, every entrepreneurial strategy, every success story I could find online. I wasn't looking for get-rich-quick schemes or unrealistic promises. I was looking for legitimate ways that young people with limited capital but unlimited motivation had built sustainable income streams. What I discovered was a gap in the local market that perfectly matched my interests and abilities. Digital marketing services for small businesses that were struggling to establish an online presence. Most small business owners in our area understood that they needed websites and social media presence to compete, but they didn't have the time, skills, or budget to hire traditional marketing agencies. They needed someone who could provide professional results at affordable prices, someone who understood both technology and business fundamentals. I had been doing social media marketing for local businesses throughout high school, but always as a side hustle, never as a serious business venture. Now I was going to transform that experience into something that could generate real income, something that could prove that intelligence and effort were more valuable than credentials and connections. The plan was simple in concept, but challenging in execution. I would start by offering basic services, website creation, social media management, online advertising, to small businesses at prices significantly lower than established agencies. Once I proved my value and built a client base, I would expand services and gradually increase prices as demand grew. But I needed clients, and clients required trust. And trust was difficult to establish when you were 18 years old, recently evicted, and operating out of your aunt's spare bedroom. That's where Dad's reputation in the community became unexpectedly valuable. Despite our recent financial catastrophe, people still remembered him as someone who had been reliable, honest, and competent. When I approached small business owners about marketing services, his recommendation carried weight that my age and circumstances couldn't provide. The first client was Mr. Rodriguez, who owned a small restaurant where Dad had eaten lunch during his years at the water treatment plant. Mr. Rodriguez knew our family's situation and was willing to give me a chance, partly out of sympathy, but mostly because his restaurant desperately needed help establishing an online presence. I spent 3 weeks creating a website, setting up social media accounts, and developing an online advertising campaign that increased his dinner reservations by 40% in the first month. The success was exactly what I needed to prove that I could deliver professional results despite my youth and unconventional circumstances. Word spread quickly in our tight-knit community. Small businesses that had known my father began reaching out, curious about the kid who was apparently helping restaurants and retail stores increase their customer base through some kind of internet magic they didn't understand but definitely wanted. Within 2 months, I had 12 clients paying between $500 and $1,500 per month for various combinations of website management, social media marketing, and online advertising. It wasn't enough to replace Dad's lost income, but it was enough to start rebuilding our family's financial foundation. More importantly, it was enough to give Dad hope that his son might be capable of achieving something he had never been able to accomplish. Building a business that couldn't be eliminated by budget cuts or economic downturns or other people's decisions about efficiency and restructuring. Every no brought me closer to understanding what yes would require. And what it required was proving, over and over again, that age was irrelevant when results were measurable. The breakthrough came 6 months after our eviction, when Sarah Chen, who owned a chain of 3 fitness studios, hired me to completely rebuild her online presence. Her previous marketing agency had been charging $3,000 per month for services that weren't generating measurable results. She was frustrated, considering canceling all digital marketing, when a mutual contact suggested she talk to Marcus Washington's kid who's been helping small businesses grow their customer base. Sarah was skeptical about hiring an 18-year-old for a project that could determine the success or failure of her business expansion plans. But she was also desperate enough to try something different, and my portfolio of successful local campaigns was compelling enough to overcome her initial reservations. The fitness studio project became my proving ground. Sarah needed not just basic website and social media services, but comprehensive digital marketing strategy that included customer retention programs, membership growth campaigns, and integration with her existing business systems. I spent weeks learning about fitness industry marketing, studying successful campaigns from around the country, and developing strategies specifically tailored to her target demographic and local market conditions. The work required 12-hour days and constant learning, but it also provided an opportunity to prove that I could handle complex projects that traditional agencies would charge 5-figure fees to complete. The results exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. Within 3 months, Sarah's membership base had increased by 60%. Her customer retention rates had improved significantly, and she was generating enough additional revenue to open a 4th location. But the most important result wasn't financial, it was the credibility that comes from undeniable success. Sarah became my most enthusiastic advocate, recommending my services to other business owners and serving as a reference for prospects who were hesitant to work with someone so young. Success wasn't guaranteed, But failure was no longer acceptable. And success, I learned, had a momentum of its own. By my 19th birthday, I was managing digital marketing for 43 local businesses, had hired 2 part-time employees to help with the growing workload, and was generating enough monthly income to support my family while saving for our future housing down payment. But the most satisfying achievement wasn't the money. It was watching Dad's confidence slowly return as he realized that his son had inherited his work ethic and his commitment to excellence, but had applied those values to opportunities that hadn't existed when he was starting his career. Dad joined my business 6 months later, not as an employee, but as a partner. His experience managing people and systems, combined with his reputation in the community, provided exactly the credibility and operational expertise that my growing company needed. The dynamic between us had changed completely. Instead of me looking to him for answers, we were solving problems together, combining his decades of experience with my technological skills and entrepreneurial energy. "Son," he told me one evening as we worked late in our new office space, "I spent 15 years thinking that success meant having a stable job with good benefits. You taught me that success means building something that can't be taken away by other people's decisions. I wasn't just earning money, I was earning back my father's dignity. And in the process, I was learning that the greatest gift you can give someone isn't financial support, but the opportunity to rediscover their own value and capability. What would you sacrifice to restore your father's pride? When does a son become responsible for saving the man who raised him? Have you ever had to choose between accepting your family's defeat and fighting for their resurrection, even when you're barely old enough to vote?" These weren't abstract questions anymore. They were the daily reality of running a business while rebuilding a family's reputation, of proving that 18-year-old determination could overcome 50-year-old systemic barriers, of learning that sometimes the most important education happens outside any classroom. 2 years after our eviction, we moved into a house that was bigger and better than the one we had lost. But the most important difference wasn't the size or location. It was that this house was paid for with money we had earned through our own business, money that represented our family's resilience rather than our vulnerability to other people's decisions. The neighborhood was different too. Instead of being the family that everyone whispered about after the eviction, we were the family that everyone asked for business advice. Dad's reputation had been restored not through explanation or apology, but through the undeniable success of what we had built together. But the transformation went deeper than financial recovery. Our family dynamics had fundamentally changed in ways that made us stronger and more connected than we had ever been before our crisis. Dad was no longer just my father. He was my business partner, someone whose experience and wisdom were essential to our continued success. I was no longer just his son. I was someone whose skills and vision had proven capable of creating opportunities that traditional employment couldn't provide. Mom had expanded her home health aid work into a small agency, using the business principles she had learned from watching our marketing company grow. She was now employing 8 other caregivers and serving clients throughout the county, having discovered that entrepreneurship was more fulfilling and profitable than working for other people's agencies. Even Keisha had been inspired by our family's transformation. She had left her hospital job to start a mobile health clinic that brought medical services to underserved rural communities, combining her nursing skills with business strategies she had learned from watching her little brother build something from nothing. The most meaningful moment came 18 months after our eviction, when Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had stood on her porch shaking her head during our family's darkest hour, knocked on our office door asking for help with marketing her husband's plumbing business. "I know things were difficult between our families," she said, looking embarrassed but determined. "But everyone in the neighborhood talks about how successful you've become, and my husband really needs help getting more customers." I could have been petty. I could have reminded her about the way she had watched our humiliation without offering assistance. I could have made her feel as small as she had made my father feel that terrible morning when our belongings were piled on the sidewalk. Instead, I offered her the same professional service I provided to every client, because success isn't about revenge. It's about proving that circumstances don't determine character, and that dignity can be rebuilt through action rather than resentment. Working with Mrs. Patterson's husband taught me something important about forgiveness and community. People who judge others during their worst moments are often doing so out of fear that similar circumstances could happen to them. Compassion, even for those who haven't shown compassion to you, is a choice that says more about your character than their actions ever could. 3 years after our eviction, I was invited to speak at the local high school's career day about entrepreneurship and business development. Standing in front of students who were the same age I had been when our family lost everything, I tried to explain what I had learned about turning crisis into opportunity. Failure, I told them, isn't what happens when you lose something you thought was permanent. Failure is what happens when you accept that loss as the end of your story instead of the beginning of a better chapter. I talked about the importance of identifying problems that needed solving, about building skills that couldn't be outsourced or eliminated, about understanding that age and credentials matter less than results and determination. But mostly, I talked about the responsibility that comes with success. The obligation to use your achievements to help other people discover their own capabilities, to prove that circumstances don't determine destiny, and to understand that individual success means nothing if it doesn't contribute to community strength. After my presentation, a senior named Marcus, the same name as my father, approached me with questions about starting his own business. His family was facing foreclosure, his father had been laid off 6 months earlier, and he was considering skipping college to help with family finances. The situation you're describing, I told him, sounds exactly like what my family went through. And what I learned is that the best way to help your family isn't to sacrifice your own future, but to build a future big enough to include everyone you care about. I offered him an internship with our company, the opportunity to learn digital marketing skills while earning money to help his family and gaining experience that would be valuable regardless of whether he pursued college or entrepreneurship. 6 months later, Marcus had developed enough expertise to start taking on his own clients, and his family had avoided foreclosure through the additional income his work generated. But more importantly, he had learned what I had learned, that young people with limited resources but unlimited determination could build something sustainable if they were willing to work harder and learn faster than their competition. The man who had cried in front of neighbors was learning to stand tall again. But he was standing tall not because he had returned to his former position, but because he had discovered a new definition of success that couldn't be taken away by budget cuts or economic downturns or other people's decisions about efficiency and restructuring. 4 years after our eviction, Dad and I were running a digital marketing agency with 23 full-time employees and clients in 4 states. Our annual revenue exceeded what Dad had earned in his entire 15-year career with the municipal water department. But the most satisfying achievement wasn't the financial success. It was the knowledge that we had built something that created opportunities for other people. 8 of our employees were young people from our local community who had learned digital marketing skills through our internship program. 12 of our clients were minority-owned businesses that had struggled to compete with larger companies until they developed strong online presence through our services. Most importantly, our success had become a proof of concept for other families facing similar challenges. When people in our community experienced job loss or financial crisis, they didn't just see those circumstances as personal failures anymore. They saw them as opportunities to build something better, something that couldn't be eliminated by other people's decisions. The ripple effects of changing one family's story had become a wave that lifted the entire community. On the 5th anniversary of our eviction, Dad and I drove past the house on Maple Street where we used to live. The new owners had painted it a different color and added a fence, but it still looked exactly like the home where I had learned to be proud of who I was and where I came from. "Do you ever regret losing that house?" Dad asked as we sat in the car, remembering the morning when our belongings had been piled on the sidewalk in front of neighbors who had once respected us. "No," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. Losing that house taught us something we never would have learned if we had kept it. That home isn't a place you own, it's a sense of security you build. And security that comes from what you create can never be taken away by what other people decide. Dad nodded slowly. "Your grandfather used to say that the most valuable inheritance he could give me was the knowledge that setbacks are temporary if you refuse to let them become permanent." "What's the most valuable inheritance you want to give me?" I asked. Dad smiled. "The knowledge that your children will never have to watch their father cry in front of the neighbors because their father learned how to build something that can't be broken by other people's decisions." 6 months later, we opened our second office location, and launched a nonprofit program that provided free digital marketing training to unemployed adults and recent high school graduates. The program was funded by a percentage of our company's profits and staffed by employees who volunteered their time to teach skills that could lead to immediate employment or entrepreneurial opportunities. The first graduate of our training program was a 52-year-old man named Robert, whose manufacturing job had been eliminated after 28 years. He reminded me of Dad, proud, hardworking, devastated by circumstances beyond his control, and desperate to rebuild his life with dignity intact. Robert completed our 6-week program and immediately started offering social media management services to local businesses. Within 3 months, he was earning more than he had made at the manufacturing plant. Within 6 months, he had hired 2 assistants and was expanding his services to include website development. But the most meaningful moment came when Robert sent me a handwritten thank you note that said, "You didn't just teach me new skills. You taught me that 52 isn't too old to start over, and that losing a job doesn't mean losing your value." That's when I understood what my father had been trying to teach me all those years about respect and consistency and making sure people could count on you. Real success isn't about accumulating wealth or achieving recognition. It's about using your capabilities to help other people discover their own capabilities. 7 years after watching my father cry in front of the neighbors, I was invited to give the commencement address at the local community college. Standing at the podium, looking out at graduates who represented every age and background, I thought about the journey that had brought our family from eviction to entrepreneurship. The most important thing I learned, I told them, is that your current circumstances are just your starting point, not your destination. The question isn't whether you'll face setbacks and challenges. The question is whether you'll use those experiences to build something stronger than what you lost. I talked about the importance of transforming pain into purpose, about understanding that individual success means nothing unless it creates opportunities for other people, about recognizing that the strongest communities are built by people who refuse to let temporary defeats become permanent conditions. Some of you have watched people you love struggle with circumstances beyond their control, I continued. Some of you have experienced failure, rejection, and humiliation that made you question your own worth. What I want you to understand is that those experiences aren't evidence of your limitations. They're preparation for your transformation. The applause was generous, but the moment that mattered most came afterward, when a middle-aged woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "My husband lost his job 8 months ago," she whispered. "We're facing foreclosure, and I've been watching him lose hope every day. After hearing your story, I think there might be another way forward." I handed her my business card and smiled. There's always another way forward. The question is whether you're ready to build it. That conversation reminded me why our family's transformation had been about more than just financial recovery. It had been about proving that dignity could be rebuilt, that respect could be earned again, and that the people who witness your lowest moments could become the people who celebrate your highest achievements. 8 years after our eviction, Dad and I were featured on the cover of our city's business magazine as Entrepreneurs of the Year. The photo showed us standing in front of our company headquarters, a building we owned rather than rented, surrounded by employees whose careers we had helped launch. But the image that meant the most to me wasn't from the magazine cover. It was from our company's annual holiday party, where Dad gave a speech to our staff about the importance of persistence and the power of believing in each other. 8 years ago, he said, his voice strong and confident, my family lost our home, and I thought I had lost my purpose. What I discovered was that sometimes you have to lose everything you thought defined you in order to discover what actually defines you. He looked directly at me. My son taught me that dignity isn't about what you own or what position you hold. It's about what you're willing to build when everything else falls apart. And that the greatest gift you can give your children isn't protection from failure, but the tools to transform failure into foundation. The applause that followed wasn't polite or obligatory. It was the sound of people who understood that they were witnessing something rare and precious, a man who had found his way back to strength, not by returning to what he used to be, but by becoming something he had never imagined he could be. Later that evening, as we cleaned up after the party, Dad pulled me aside for a conversation that I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. "Son," he said, "I need to tell you something that I should have said years ago. The day we were evicted, I thought I had failed you as a father. I thought I had proven that all my talk about hard work and persistence was just empty words that couldn't protect my family when it mattered most. He paused, looking around our office at the evidence of what we had built together. What you taught me is that being a good father isn't about preventing your children from seeing you struggle. It's about showing them how to respond when struggling seems like the only option. You didn't just save our family. You taught me what strength actually looks like. I thought about that 18-year-old kid who had watched his hero become human and realized he had to become the hero. About the choice between accepting defeat and fighting for resurrection. About the difference between falling down and staying down. "Dad," I said, "you never stopped being my hero. You just became a different kind of hero, the kind who shows his son that it's okay to be broken as long as you're not broken forever." 9 years after our eviction, we celebrated Christmas in the house we had built with our own success, surrounded by family members whose lives had been transformed by our transformation. Keisha's mobile health clinic was serving 3 counties and had inspired similar programs in other states. Mom's Care Agency was the largest minority-owned healthcare business in our region. Even my cousin Marcus, who had started as an intern, was now running his own digital marketing firm in another city. But the most meaningful gift under our tree wasn't expensive or elaborate. It was a framed photograph that Dad had found while organizing old papers. It showed our family standing in front of the Maple Street house during better times, all of us smiling and confident, believing that stability was permanent and setbacks were temporary. "I kept this picture," Dad explained, "because I wanted to remember who we used to be. But looking at it now, I realize we became something better than who we used to be. We became the kind of people who could lose everything and build it back stronger." That photograph became a reminder that the most powerful transformations often begin with the most devastating losses, that the families who survive together become the families who thrive together, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give your parents is proving that their struggles taught you something valuable about resilience. 10 years after watching my father cry in front of the neighbors, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee about entrepreneurship and economic development in underserved communities. Sitting at that witness table, representing not just my own success, but the success of everyone whose lives had been changed by our transformation, I felt the weight of responsibility that comes with unexpected opportunities. "Representatives," I began. "A decade ago, my family lost our home to foreclosure, and I watched my father's dignity crumble in front of our entire community. Today, that same father is my business partner in a company that employs 47 people and generates millions of dollars in annual revenue. I presented research about the economic impact of entrepreneurship programs, statistics about job creation in minority communities, and policy recommendations for supporting small business development in areas that had been overlooked by traditional economic development initiatives. The difference between those two moments, eviction and entrepreneurship, wasn't luck or special circumstances," I explained. "It was the understanding that individual setbacks could become community solutions if we were willing to work together to build something that didn't exist before." I outlined proposals for expanding access to business education, providing microloans for startup ventures, and creating mentorship programs that connected experienced entrepreneurs with young people who had potential but limited resources. "Economic development isn't about attracting outside companies to create jobs," I concluded. "It's about empowering local people to create their own opportunities, to solve their own problems, and to prove that communities can transform themselves if they're given the tools and support they need." After the hearing, several representatives approached me with questions about bringing our model to their districts. Others asked about policy changes that could make entrepreneurship more accessible to people facing economic challenges. But the conversation that meant the most came from a staff member who pulled me aside after the formal proceedings ended. "My father lost his job 2 years ago," she said quietly. "He's been struggling with depression and feels like his career is over. After hearing your testimony, I think I know how to help him see this as an opportunity instead of an ending." I gave her my contact information and offered to connect her father with resources and mentorship that could help him explore entrepreneurial options. "The most important thing," I told her, "is helping him understand that his experience and skills are assets, not liabilities. Sometimes the people who have faced the most challenges are the best equipped to solve other people's challenges." That conversation reminded me that our family's story had never been just about us. It had been about proving that transformation was possible, that dignity could be restored, and that the people who witnessed your failures could become the people who celebrated your success. 11 years after our eviction, Dad and I were invited to speak at a national conference on family business development. Standing on that stage together, looking out at an audience of entrepreneurs and business leaders from across the country, I felt proud not just of what we had accomplished, but of how we had accomplished it. "The most valuable lesson my son taught me," Dad said during his portion of our presentation, "is that falling down isn't failure, staying down is failure, and that the people who love you aren't impressed by your ability to avoid problems. They're inspired by your ability to solve problems." When it was my turn to speak, I talked about the responsibility that comes with success, about the importance of using your achievements to create opportunities for other people, and about understanding that individual transformation means nothing unless it contributes to community transformation. 11 years ago, I said, I watched my father cry in front of our neighbors when we lost our house. Today, those same neighbors send their children to internship programs at our company. The difference isn't that we became different people. It's that we learned to use our experiences to help other people avoid the mistakes we made and replicate the successes we achieved. The presentation ended with a standing ovation, but the real success wasn't the applause. It was the knowledge that our story had become a template for other families facing similar challenges, proof that circumstances don't determine destiny, and that setbacks can become setups for something better. After the conference, Dad and I drove home in comfortable silence, both of us thinking about the journey that had brought us from eviction to entrepreneurship, from humiliation to hope, from crying in front of neighbors to inspiring people across the country. "Son," Dad said as we pulled into the driveway of our home, "do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't been evicted? If I hadn't lost my job, if we had just continued living the same comfortable life we had before?" I thought about that question for a moment, imagining an alternate timeline where our family had never faced crisis, where I had gone to college as planned, where Dad had worked at the water treatment plant until retirement. "I think," I said finally, "we would have been happy, but we never would have discovered what we were actually capable of achieving. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened to you, but only if you're willing to do the work to transform it." Dad nodded. "Your grandfather used to say that the measure of a man isn't what he does when everything is going right. It's what he does when everything falls apart." "What do you think he would say about what we built?" I asked. Dad smiled. "I think he would say that we proved something important about the Washington family, that we don't just survive setbacks, we use them to build something stronger than what we lost." 12 years after watching my father cry in front of the neighbors, I was preparing for my wedding to Sarah, a woman I had met through our business network who shared my commitment to using entrepreneurship as a tool for community development. The ceremony was going to be held in the backyard of our family home, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by our transformation. But the moment I was most looking forward to wasn't walking down the aisle or exchanging vows. It was the father-son dance that Dad and I had planned, set to a song about second chances and the power of believing in each other. During our rehearsal, as we practiced the dance moves we had been secretly working on for months, Dad pulled me close and whispered something that brought tears to my eyes. "Son, 12 years ago I thought I had failed you as a father. Tonight, I know that you succeeded as a son in ways I never imagined possible. You didn't just save our family, you taught us what family really means." Looking around the backyard where we would celebrate the next day, I could see evidence of our transformation everywhere. The house we had built with our own success, the business that had grown beyond our wildest dreams, the community of people who had been inspired by our journey from eviction to entrepreneurship. But the most important evidence wasn't material. It was the relationship between a father and son who had learned that the strongest bonds are forged not in comfort, but in crisis, not in success, but in the struggle to rebuild after everything falls apart. If you believe that the greatest gift you can give your father is proving that his son inherited his strength, not his struggles, that falling down isn't failure unless you choose to stay down, and that sometimes the people who witness your lowest moments can become the people who celebrate your highest achievements, then this story matters to you too. Subscribe for more stories about young people who refuse to let their family's defeat become permanent, who learned that dignity can be rebuilt through action rather than explanation, and who discovered that individual transformation means nothing unless it creates opportunities for community transformation. Because that day, watching my father cry in front of the neighbors taught me something no classroom ever could. That sometimes the greatest gift you can give your father is proving that his son inherited his strength, not his struggles. That respect, once lost, can be earned again through consistency and results. And that the most powerful revenge against circumstances that try to break you is building something so strong that breaking becomes impossible. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that 12 years can change everything, that the worst moments can become the foundation for the best achievements, and that sometimes the most important lesson you can teach your community is that circumstances don't determine character. Choices do. Because sometimes the greatest honor you can give the man who raised you is proving that his investment in your character was worth more than any inheritance he could have left you. And that the tears he cried in front of the neighbors weren't the end of his story. They were the beginning of a legacy that would inspire people he would never meet to believe that transformation is always possible.